Tiger-Sul since 1964, leading with superior sulfur backed by innovation, research, and education.
Hi, I'm James Alexander, the account manager for Tiger-Sul in Saskatchewan. This year, we've had a drought of major epic proportions. In fact, it's expanded our borders and covered most of Western Canada, the Northern Great Plains, as well as the Pacific Northwest, and even stretching as far south as California. With this drought, it's caused a lot of anxiety and questions. And one of the major questions we have is, what is going to be left for the fertilizer since the crop didn't utilize all the nutrients that were available? Plants have to drink up their nutrients, and without water, they haven't been able to do that. So we've asked our two agronomists, Wesley Hahn and David Onnes, to answer some of those questions and help provide some strategy for the upcoming year to help with your fertility program.
David, I've had many growers and retailers wondering, based on the drought this year, it's limited the crop's ability to utilize all of the nutrients that were applied. Can they extend a 3-year program with Tiger 90 to 4 years?
James, it's not easy to predict the amount of sulfur available to a plant, especially after a drought, even using soil testing. Soil testing is perhaps the easiest test to perform, but it isn't the best indicator of plant available sulfur. Although soil testing provides the basis for measuring other nutrients in the soil, accurately measuring sulfate and nitrate can be difficult. Now, I recommend that you go from past plant tissue test, field history of sulfur deficiencies, and personal experience in order to determine sulfur deficiencies. Moisture is an essential factor needed for soil bacteria to convert sulfur to sulfate. Therefore, dry soil conditions limit sulfur oxidation. Rainfall received in late summer to early fall and soil temperatures above 65 degrees Fahrenheit or about 18 degrees Celsius will contribute to some sulfur to sulfate conversion. The extent of the conversion will be a function of the bacteria recovering from the dry soil conditions. Any remaining sulfate in the soil will be subject potentially to leaching during the winter months. I anticipate that any sulfur bentonite that remains can become available next spring. Extending the 3-year program to 4 may work, depending on how low the soil sulfur levels in the field are. How much of the sulfur is left for the plant? This is unknown. Regardless, I would caution anyone that has soil test sulfur levels less than 15 parts per million or 30 pounds per acre to plan on adding sulfur to their fertilizer program next year.
David, we expect some soil tests this fall may show a high level of all nutrients. That's now, but can we expect changes come next spring? Or maybe, can you tell us what nutrients have the highest risk of losses till next spring's planting season?
James, let me start by saying this. Nitrate and sulfate are the two nutrients that have the highest potential for loss. This is because they are highly mobile in the soil. Sulfate moves a little slower than nitrate and can be adsorbed on the soil's clay particles. I expect to see the largest potential losses with the sulfate and nitrate on coarser, sandier soil types with low organic matter and low cation exchange capacities. Phosphorus is primarily lost from the field through 3 processes: attached to the sediment that's eroded from the field, dissolved in the surface water runoff, or dissolved in leachate and carried through the soil profile. Potassium loss from the soil is primarily due to crop removal. It can be leached, but usually the leaching is only minor. You need to know that collecting soil samples while the soil is dry can result in potassium levels being skewed higher than the actual values in the soil. But to answer your question, the nitrate and sulfate will typically have the most movement of the nutrients in the field. But ultimately, the degree of movement of these nutrients will depend on the environmental conditions and soil type.
As you know, David, it's been a tough year. If a grower needs to cut his expenses, what can you suggest he reduce or remove from his fertilizer program?
Refer to your soil test. Soil testing has the potential of providing the most return on investment by cost of anything on the farm. Don't eliminate soil testing to save cost. And soil sample correctly. If nutrients in the field are sufficient, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, consider reducing the highest nutrient or nutrients as indicated by the soil test. Now, this is going to vary by crop. Make sure to meet the plant's nitrogen and sulfur needs for plant uptake. I know, fertilizing to plant uptake requires more fertilizer than fertilizing for crop removal. However, we want to avoid reduced yields caused by hidden hunger. If you are evaluating the soil test phosphorus and potassium, fertilizing according to crop removal is sufficient. As far as your soil test, remember that soils are highly variable. Consider reducing the number of acres in the composite sample to no more than about 40 uniform acres. To increase the accuracy of the soil test, consider increasing the number of cores in the composite sample to 15 to 20. As the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. If you take the time and expense of soil sampling, make sure it's worthwhile. When using a site-specific approach, this may be the year you choose to intensively sample to determine fertility changes in the soil.
David, we are seeing fields that are highly variable, where parts of the field received more moisture than some of the other areas, due to it either being a low spot or even snowdrifts. Yields in these areas have been good compared to the rest of the field. So tell us, how does one manage these areas where the fertilizer may have been used versus other areas of the field where we would suspect the levels of nutrients to still be high?
Again, soil test. Because unless you test, it's just a guess. You can either spend money that isn't needed on fertility, cost yourself money by reducing yields, or make the correct fertility application. So let's take the guesswork out of soil fertility as much as possible. As far as taking the guess out of soil fertility, consider using a site-specific approach. When using a site-specific approach, consider that accuracy has inherent cost as well as benefits. Used with variable rate technology, site-specific management distributes fertilizers and other amendments according to the spatial variation of the field. As far as those low-yielding areas in the field, what are the levels of the soil test phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur? The only way we're going to have a good idea about the levels is to soil test. How much fertilizer? That's best left to the soil analysis.
David, this year some growers were forced to take off their crop as green feed. What considerations regarding their fertility program do they need to consider for next year?
In this picture, it shows a premature field of wheat being cut for hay, not grain. Nutrient management for forages is significantly different than conventional row crops. When whole plants are removed from the field, significant amounts of expensive nutrients are removed with the crop. Farmers need to assess the potential nutrients removed according to the crop. They need to be prepared to replace those nutrients this fall or next spring. And we're back to soil testing. Speaking of testing, you may want to test any crop that you've baled for nitrates. Once nitrates are in a plant, high levels can cause problems for livestock.
David, we know that soil microorganisms need moisture too. So how is their population affected by the drought? And will it impact their ability for breaking down the fertilizer in the future?
Soil microorganisms can help plants in a drought. Now, that's not to say their numbers can't be reduced, but they tend to bounce back quickly with favorable environmental conditions. Some of the microorganisms, they help the plant directly, making it more drought tolerant. Some can hurt the plants, and yet others convert nutrients from plant unavailable forms to plant available forms. Not all nutrients depend on bacteria. However, nitrogen and sulfur do. While Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter take care of the conversion of nitrogen to nitrite and then to nitrate, Thiobacillus is the heavy lifter when it comes to converting sulfur to plant-available sulfate. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. Several studies show nitrogen and sulfur work together to improve the nitrogen use efficiency, or the NUE, of a plant. Plants with an increased nitrogen use efficiency allow the plants to better survive in drought situations. However, if it's too dry, there's nothing short of a timely rainfall that's going to save the plants. I'd like to go a little more in depth about sulfur and nitrogen working together. As we've discussed in our webinars before, sulfur is an essential plant nutrient for crop production. For oil crop producers, sulfur fertilizer is especially important because oil crops require more sulfur than the cereal crops. Sulfur is best known for its role in the formation of amino acids. Methionine, for example, which is composed of 21% sulfur, and cysteine, which is composed of about 27% sulfur. Also for the synthesis of proteins and chlorophyll, oil content of the seeds, and nutritive quality of forages. But all this is dependent on there being adequate nitrogen available to the plant. Too much nitrogen in the plants can and will show more sulfur deficiencies. If you have sulfur and nitrogen working together, you can increase your nitrogen use efficiency. As I've said before, increasing your nitrogen use efficiency increases the plant's water use efficiency. In other words, it makes the plant more drought tolerant, not resistant, but drought tolerant could be the difference between harvesting a crop and baling it. James, if you don't mind, I'll start wrapping this up by sharing some of my thoughts of things we should be doing for next year. What's worked well in the past may not work well next year. We may be forced to think outside the box. Don't guess. Soil test. Evaluate your fertilizer on the basis of cost per actual pound of nutrient and fit in your management program. Remember, phosphorus and potassium measurements are an index, not an absolute. If soil test sulfur is below 15 parts per million or 30 pounds per acre, strongly consider an application of Tiger 90 CR or Tiger XP. If it's below 10 parts per million or 20 pounds per acre, we're not dealing with hidden hunger. There is a high potential for sulfur deficiencies in your field.
Thank you, Wes and David, for those words of advice. You know, it's really, when it comes down to, is we need moisture. And until then, you know, all we can do is try and do our best and plan as best we can with what we know. So good luck in 2022.
Tiger-Sul since 1964, leading with superior sulfur backed by innovation, research, and education.